If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network. The Kansas City Mafia, also known as the Savella crime family, is an Italian-American organized crime syndicate based in Kansas City, Missouri. Italian-American organized crime began when two Sicilian mobsters known as the DiGiovanni brothers fled Sicily for Kansas City. Joseph DiGiovanni and Sugarhouse Pete DiGiovanni began making money from a variety of criminal operations shortly after they arrived in the city. Joseph DiGiovanni, also known as Joe Scarface, was a notorious Kansas City mobster and boss of the Kansas City crime family. Joseph arrived in Kansas City in 1912 fleeing a murder investigation, where he joined the Black Hand. He allegedly became boss of the Black Hand gang that would be the predecessor of the Kansas City Mafia. Joseph, along with his brother and underboss, Pietro DiGiovanni, began making money from a variety of criminal operations shortly after they arrived. They engaged in Black Hand extortion within the Sicilian and Italian communities in Kansas City. A botched attempt at insurance fraud by attempting to firebomb a building left Joseph permanently scarred on his face and part of his body. In 1924, he became a naturalized American citizen. Joe Scarface, as he became known, and his brother Pete were once arrested by a police detective on extortion charges after many local owners filed charges against them. The brothers sent a warning message when the detective was shot dead before they could be taken to trial. Joe's arrest record also included charges of murder and also kidnapping, but none of the charges ever stuck. Besides several minor bootlegging convictions, his only serious conviction was from a 1929 rape charge. Joe allegedly could not read or write in English and could barely speak the language. The brothers expanded their organization by entering into a bootlegging partnership with James Balistrier, who would later help the mobsters start a wholesale liquor business. Their fortunes improved greatly with the introduction of the Prohibition. They was the only group bootlegging alcohol in Kansas City. Their rackets at this time were controlled by Johnny Laia, who later became the leading figure when the organization expanded. The gang was given virtually a free hand to operate by their boss Tom Pendergast. Tom controlled most of Kansas City's government at the time. Under Pendergast, Kansas City became a wide-open town with absolutely no alcohol-related arrests being made in the city during the entirety of Prohibition. The DiGiovanni family greatly benefited from this. During the 1930s, Joe DiGiovanni allegedly masterminded a large-scale heroin operation. The ring was decimated when several members were indicted in 1942. He continued to be seen as the boss of the Kansas City mob until 1950. He is believed to have retired from the Kansas City Mafia in 1953, but still wielded great influence within the family. After Prohibition, the Kansas City Mafia seems to have been under the control of Charles Bonagio, who was connected to the Pendergast political machine. Bonagio might also have had a hand in St. Louis area gambling. Some believe Bonagio was merely a frontman, while underworld orders continued to come from Joseph DiGiovanni. At that time, Balistrier put his Mason skills to use, constructing a local restaurant casino establishment. The gambling establishment became known as the White House. He also managed the Keno games for Pendergast as well. Charles Bonagio earned his prominence in the Kansas City family by earning a lot of money from liquor and gambling. On July 20, 1931, he was arrested in Kansas City following a shootout that killed a Prohibition officer and two others. Prohibition agents and local police had raided the mob-run flower shop at 1039 East Independence Avenue looking for evidence in a recent killing. The building was also the headquarters of Joe Lusco, a lieutenant of John Laia. During the raid, a shootout started, followed by a fire. Bonagio, who was in the flower shop during the raid, was arrested and taken in for questioning. However, the police determined that he hadn't taken part in the shootout and released him with a vagrancy charge. After the shootout, John Laia took Charles under his wing. John had established a political club called the North Side Democratic Club. He wanted to increase his family's power in Kansas City. This led to Bonagio's involvement with the local and state political scene that would last until his death in 1950. In 1934, John Laia was assassinated and his underboss Charles Corallo took control of the family. At some point, Bonagio became Corallo's underboss. In 1939, Corallo was caught up in a citywide cleanup campaign and was sent to prison for income tax evasion. This opened the way for Bonagio to become the Kansas City mob's boss in October 1939. The Kansas City crime family had always enjoyed a violent reputation. It started back to the turn of the 20th century when the Black Hand version of the Mafia terrorized the city's north side. The violence had reached a peak during and immediately following the lazy years from 1928 to 1934. Things had remained relatively quiet under Corallo's rule. This would change under Bonagio as several unsolved mob slayings occurred during his reign. Bonagio and the local mob continued to get rich through their gambling and liquor interests. From the 1930s on, he was also part of the narcotics ring started by the Giovanni brothers. This ring imprisoned mobsters in Kansas City, St. Louis, Tampa, Florida, and other cities. Bonagio himself escaped being linked to this drug ring. However, one of his main lieutenants, Joe DeLuca, was sent to prison when a low-level member of the ring, Carl Caramusa, turned state's evidence. In 1945, Caramusa was found murdered on a Chicago street. In the early 1940s, Bonagio turned his attention to politics and formed his own political club. The First Ward Democratic Club, which it was called, slowly began taking over wards in Kansas City's north side. In the process, Bonagio became a major rival of Jim Pendergast, the nephew of former Kansas City political boss Tom Pendergast, and his Democratic faction. Bonagio's goal was to elect his candidate to the Missouri governorship. In 1944, his first candidate was defeated in the primary election by the Pendergast candidate. In 1948, Bonagio was more successful. He backed the Democratic nominee Forrest Smith and used his mob connections to help Smith win the election. He had approached the National Commission for a loan between $200,000 and $2 million for Smith's election campaign. If he won, the payback would be Smith helping the mob open Missouri to gambling. Bonagio reportedly received the money at the home of Charles Fischetti, a Chicago mobster. At that time, Kansas City was subservient to Chicago in the mob hierarchy. Using mob money and manpower, Bonagio managed to get Smith elected governor. The 1948 election also brought President Harry Truman, a Missouri native, re-election into the White House. To celebrate this victory, Bonagio chartered a private railroad car for transportation to the inauguration ceremony in Washington. However, Truman was a staunch Pendergast supporter, and he made it abundantly clear that Bonagio was not welcome at the ceremony. On the night of April 5, 1950, Bonagio and his underboss, Charles Gargata, were called to meet some unknown persons at the First Ward Democratic Club near downtown Kansas City. Bonagio left his driver and bodyguard, Nick Penna, at the family social club, saying that he would return in a few minutes. Bonagio and Gargata then borrowed a car and drove off to the Democratic Club. Shortly after 8 p.m., residents in apartments above the Democratic Club reported hearing several shots. 8 hours later, a cab driver going to a nearby cafe noticed that the club door was open. He also heard water running inside. The police were called and found the bodies of Charles Bonagio and Charles Gargata inside the club. Bonagio was seated at a desk and Gargata was lying inside the front door. Both men had been shot in the head. The police theorized that Gargata had been trying to escape the club when he was shot. It has been rumored that Bonagio and Gargata were murdered by St. Louis mobsters, others say the hit came from Chicago. However, it is most likely that the two mob bosses were killed by members of their own crime family under orders from the Mafia Commission in New York. Bonagio was seen as a liability to the commission and it was decided that he should be killed. The probable organizer of the hit was Gizo, who no doubt received the leadership of the Kansas City family as a reward. In any case, the murderers were never found. Gargata and Bonagio built a gambling ring that grossed as much as $34 million a year on dice games, card games, the numbers racket, and bookmaking. Gargata was arrested more than 40 times over a 30-year period for murder, illegal gambling, liquor law violations, carrying a concealed weapon, robbery, auto theft, extortion, attempted burglary, and vagrancy. However, due to his political influence, all of these charges were eventually dropped. The high-profile murders of Gargata and Bonagio, along with their subversion of the criminal justice system, created public pressure on President Harry Truman to support a congressional investigation into organized crime. The new boss, Anthony Gizo, was once described as being a bookmaker, gambler and traveling contact for the mafia. In the early 1920s, after being arrested on a narcotics charge, he attempted to bribe a federal officer with $10,000 and was charged and convicted in 1924. He served 1 year in prison for the crime. Gizo was a close friend of Charles Bonagio. In 1930, Gizo and Bonagio were arrested in Denver, Colorado, on a minor charge. During this time, both men were lieutenants to Kansas City North End political boss, John Laia. They ran his illegal gambling operations. Anthony soon became known as one of the 5 Iron Men due to his underworld clout. He ran the family well for about 3 years. His driver during 1950 was Nicholas Avella, who would eventually succeed him as boss of the Kansas City crime family. On April 1, 1953, Anthony Gizo died of a heart attack in Dallas, Texas. Giuseppe Nicoli Savella was the son of Italian immigrants in Kansas City. He was the younger brother of mobster and future boss Carl Savella and the uncle of mobster Anthony Savella. Nick began his criminal career as a teenager in the Italian northeast neighborhood of Kansas City. Savella's first arrest was at age 10, after which he dropped out of school. Before he reached age 20, Savella had been arrested for auto theft, illegal gambling and robbery. He spent 2 months in prison for bootlegging in 1932. In 1934 he got married to a woman named Catherine, who was his wife for almost 50 years. In the early 1940s, Savella became a Democratic Party precinct worker on the north side of Kansas City, where he became friends with Charles Bonagio. By the 1950s, Savella dominated criminal activity in Kansas City. He was identified as a figure in the organized crime society during the U.S. Senate Kefauver hearings. Savella's involvement with organized crime led to the Nevada Gaming Commission listing him as one of the first entries in the Black Book, prohibiting him from entering casinos in Nevada. Later, due to his acquaintance with Teamsters President Roy Lee Williams, Nick Savella played an important role in controlling the Central States Pension Fund of the Teamsters Union and in the skimming of casino gambling profits in Las Vegas, Nevada. In 1959, he was sent a summons before a grand jury and subsequently convicted of tax evasion. In the 2 Missouri state tax evasion cases, he was convicted and fined $150 in one case, while the other case was dismissed. During this period, he built relations with the mafia families in St. Louis, Denver, Milwaukee, and California. Savella was called to appear before a Clay County, Missouri grand jury in 1966. Afterwards, the news media asked him why it took him 15 minutes to address the group. Savella replied that he stopped in the men's room, where he was drawing dirty pictures on the wall. Law enforcement agencies did not appreciate Savella's humor or his ability to elude conviction. This would result in their constant surveillance of him for the rest of his life. The Kansas City FBI, suspecting mob involvement at the Tropicana, they set up a broad investigation, known as Operation Strawman, which involved wiretapping phones of reputed mobsters and their associates in Kansas City. From the evidence collected by taps and other eavesdropping in the late 1970s, the FBI discovered a conspiracy to skim money from the Tropicana's casino. Operation Strawman learned that Joseph Augusto, head of the Tropicana's Foley's Bergier show, controlled the skimming in the Tropicana. Augusto was secretly sending cash from the casino to Kansas City organized crime chief Nick Savella and Joseph Iupa of Chicago, as well as Cleveland and Milwaukee mobsters. Savella was convicted of illegal gambling charges in 1977 and was sent to prison. The key to the conviction was a telephone conversation recorded via wiretap during Super Bowl IV. The hometown Kansas City Chiefs were 12-point underdogs to the heavily favored Minnesota Vikings. Local action favored the hometown team. When Savella phoned his bookie to determine just how much they had lost, authorities used this recorded call to move on him and place him under arrest. He was also convicted of attempting to bribe a prison official. He wanted his nephew Anthony Savella transferred to a minimum security prison in Texas. In February 1983, Nicholas Savella received a medical release due to poor health from the Federal Medical Center, a prison medical facility at Springfield, Missouri. 2 weeks later, on March 12, 1983, Savella died of lung cancer in Kansas City. Upon his death, his brother Carl Savella became head of the Kansas City family. Carl's reign as Kansas City boss was brief. In 1984, he and his son, Anthony Savella, were convicted of skimming operations in Las Vegas casinos throughout the 1970s. Carl was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison, with another 10 years added on an unrelated charge. On October 2, 1994, Carl Savella died in prison of pneumonia. William Camisano Sr. became the family's next boss. He ran a family of around 30 made members at this time, according to the FBI. He had become a high-ranking member of Nick Savella's mafia organization. He controlled much of the vice rackets in the 12th Street district of Kansas City, which included prostitution, seedy lounges and drug peddling. Camisano used strong-arm tactics in the River Quay neighborhood redevelopment project to turn the area into a red-light district with brothels and other vice. In 1983, he was released from prison at just the right time to become the new leader of the Kansas City crime family with the 1984 imprisonment of Carl D. Luna and Anthony and Carl Savella. Because of the unfavorable publicity of recent criminal trials, the Chicago outfit officially disowned Kansas City as an affiliate. With the crime family under his control and totally independent of the Chicago outfit, this gave Kansas City boss William Camisano the opportunity to establish new operations in California, Cleveland, Florida and Washington without the outfit's approval or interference. This expansion revived the Kansas City organization. Camisano also reportedly rejuvenated the crime family's ranks by inducting 10 to 12 new members in 1987. He allegedly stepped down as boss in 1988 when Anthony Savella was released from prison. He became Anthony Savella's underboss. Other sources believe Camisano remained the boss of the Kansas City family until his death. On January 26, 1995, William Camisano died of multiple organ failure related to lung cancer. His son William Camisano Jr. pleaded guilty to running illegal gambling in Kansas City in February 2010. He is currently a free man. The family is said to currently have 25 to 35 maid members. John Laia, also known as Brother John, was an American organized crime figure in Kansas City, Missouri, during the Prohibition era. According to his draft card for World War I, he was born in New York in 1895. It was said that he dropped out of school by the 9th or 10th grade. By 1915, he was an office clerk during the day and a robber at night. In 1916, after robbing a man on the street, John was confronted by a police officer. After an exchange of gunfire, the officer arrested him. He was convicted of armed robbery and sentenced to 12 years in prison. However, 9 months later in 1917, the lieutenant governor of Missouri paroled him on the condition that he joined the United States Army. He ignored this parole condition and instead started working for the political machine controlled by Tom Pendergast. Laia, on his draft card, claimed to be the supporter of his mother and father and to have some additional difficulties. By the early 1920s, he had graduated from street crime to organizing voters for the Pendergast machine and supplying bars with bootleg whiskey. His closest associate and bodyguard was Charles Corallo. At one point when he was arrested for bootlegging, Corallo accepted the blame and a prison sentence for him. By the late 1920s, he had become the supreme gang boss in Kansas City. In 1928, Laia was appointed head of the North Side's Democratic Club. He owned a soft drink company, several upscale gambling resorts in the city, a profitable loan shark operation, and even a bail bond company. He enjoyed considerable political power within both the Kansas City Police Department and the city administration. In 1929, after failing to file a $82,000 federal tax return, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 1 year in prison. However, thanks in part to the influence of ward boss Tom Pendergast, the government released his pending appeal. Many civic reformers decried John's influence and power, but were unable to effect any changes. John's criminal activities translated into a comfortable and pleasant life. He and his wife lived in a luxury apartment in Kansas City. He vacationed at his resort on Lake Lotawana in western Missouri, where he maintained several speedboats. He also owned several thoroughbred racehorses, whom he raced at tracks around the United States. John was a constant presence at sporting and civic events and donated regularly to charities. Despite all of his criminal activities, he was able to maintain a generally positive public profile. As the 1930s began, he began experiencing more competition from other gangsters. In October 1932, Laia's men broke into the Army Armory in Kansas City to obtain more guns to fight these competitors. In June 1933, a local gang leader, Vernon Miller, requested several gunmen to free 2 bank robbers who were being transported by train through Kansas City on June 17. The plan was to ambush the law enforcement escort at Union Station in Kansas City and free their prisoners. John reportedly provided Miller with Adam Richetti and Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, a notorious bank robber. The Union Station massacre resulted in 5 deaths, 4 of them law enforcement officers. The tremendous public outrage over the shootout convinced the Pendergast machine that John had become a liability that needed to be eliminated. Without his political protection, he was indicted for bootlegging, illegal gambling and tax evasion. John eventually pleaded guilty to tax evasion and was sentenced to 1 year in prison. The Pendergast politicians also started funding a competitor, former Laia Lieutenant Michael LaCapra, to set competing gambling dens and distribution networks for alcohol and narcotics. On August 12, 1933, Laia associate Charles Gargata and other gunmen ambushed Ferris Anthon, a gunman allied with LaCapra, on a city street. However, a sheriff and his deputy coincidentally arrived during the attack, and after a shootout Gargata was captured. The guns used in the attack were eventually traced back to the armory, and Gargata went to prison. On July 10, 1934, at 3 a.m., John arrived at his hotel residence after spending the night touring his nightclubs and gambling dens with his wife and Coralla. As he was exiting from the car, gunmen armed with a submachine gun and a sawed-off shotgun emerged from the bushes. John pushed his wife back into the car and told Coralla to drive off. The gunmen sprayed him with bullets and left him on the sidewalk. He later died at St. Joseph's Hospital in Kansas City. Speaking to his doctor before dying, Laia said, "Doc, what I can't understand is why anybody would do this to me. Why to me, to Johnny Laia, who has been the friend of everybody. Laia associates immediately blamed LeCapra for Laia's murder and tried to assassinate him several times, succeeding in August 1935 in New York. However, law enforcement traced some of the bullets in John's body to bullets found in the Union Station massacre, creating suspicions that it was an ally who murdered him. Organized crime in Minneapolis first attracted national attention in 1903 when mobster mayor, Doc Ames, was exposed in a book called Shame of the Cities. The author revealed that a police department recruited from ex-felons was shaking down the Minneapolis underworld on the mayor's behalf. Ames later fled the state, spending a short time as a fugitive before being arrested and extradited to Minnesota. He was convicted of receiving bribes and sentenced to 6 years in prison. His sentence was later appealed and overturned. In 1919, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution transformed American crime, shaping small-time hoodlums into major organized crime figures. In Minneapolis, the underworld was dominated by local gangs of the Irish mob, flanked by Jewish gangsters, corrupt cops and politicians from the Republican, Democratic, and Farmer Labor parties. Romanian Jewish immigrant, Iser Blumenfeld, also known as Kid Can, was changed overnight from a nickel-and-dime pimp and bookmaker from the north side of Minneapolis into a respected godfather, with close ties to both the Chicago outfit and the Genovese crime family of New York. Assisted by his brothers Jacob and Harry, Kid Can's Minneapolis combination dealt in bootleg booze, trucking distribution routes, illegal gambling, and real estate deals throughout the American Sun Belt. He was the most notorious gangster in the city's history. Rival crime families were run by David Burman, Thomas W. Banks, and Big Ed Morgan. These gangsters tended to cooperate on business and avoid turf wars by appealing to the mediation of the National Commission. In the process, Minneapolis became a major center of bootleg booze, gambling, brothels, and unbridled corruption. Deuce Casper was a Baldy Street gang founder and boss. In Minneapolis, during Casper's time, from around 1955 to 1975, more than 1,000 thugs roamed the streets, creating mayhem and fear amongst the public. Casper's gang robbed banks, jewelry stores, and armored cars, while his associates robbed commercial businesses and ran large drug-dealing operations. The most notable member was Perry Millick. Millick ran commercial burglary rings and drug manufacturing houses. He was also involved in widespread real estate frauds and was the front man for real estate purchases for the infamous Alexander brothers, who were considered the porn and prostitution kings of the state. The Capra-Patterson Syndicate was the most recent to control all nationally organized crime activities in the Twin Cities. Gambling is their primary source of income. They are sanctioned to work under the guidance of the Genovese crime family. David the Jew Burman was a Jewish-American organized crime figure in Iowa, New York City, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was also one of the pioneers of gambling in Las Vegas, Nevada. Burman was a partner with Bugsy Siegel at the Flamingo Hotel and one of the few mobsters of his era to die a natural death. He was born into a Jewish family in Odessa, Ukraine. His father was a former rabbinical student who played the violin. When he was a young child, his father departed for America and settled in Ashley, North Dakota. The land was said to be provided by the Jewish Colonization Association. Mr. Burman then sent for his wife and children. David's mother was reportedly horrified after getting off the train. She realized that they had exchanged the warmth of Odessa for the icy cold of the Great Plains. After failing on the land, the Burmans moved to Iowa, where David got his start as a mobster. At the age of 15, he ran a crew of teenage thugs. They committed crimes such as petty shakedowns and eventually opened up a string of illegal distilleries. He then went on to run his own bank robbing crew. After developing close ties to the Genovese crime family, he moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he operated a major bookmaking operation, rivaling with local mob bosses Iser Blumenfeld and Tommy Banks. One of Burman's closest enforcers during those years was Icepick Willie Alderman, a homicidal Jewish gangster from North Minneapolis. His brother, Chicky Burman, also worked for him. Due to his close relationship with Minneapolis Mayor Marvin Klein, Burman briefly eclipsed his rivals as the head boss of the Minneapolis underworld. According to his daughter Susan, Burman also used his crew to intimidate and terrorize members of the pro-Nazi Silver Shirts, driving them out of Minneapolis. The World War II persecution of his fellow Jews enraged Burman so much that he enlisted in the Canadian Army. He had previously been turned away by the U.S. military as a convicted felon. In addition, Pearl Harbor had not yet brought the United States into World War II. He saw combat in the European theater with the 18th Regiment, 12th Manitoba Dragoons, a reconnaissance outfit, along with Minnesota friend Nathan Gitluich. Burman was well liked, and fellow troopers did not know of his criminal background. After his return to Minneapolis, his gambling operations were shattered during the first term of racket busting by Mayor Hubert Humphrey. Burman moved his crew to Las Vegas and operated with Luciano family associate, Mo Sedway. Sedway was born to a Jewish family as Morris Edwards in 1894 in Poland. At an early age, he began his criminal career in Manhattan and street gangs with Bugsy Siegel. He had a police record dating as far back as the early 1920s in New York. Later in his criminal career, he began making trips to Las Vegas on Meyer Lansky's behalf. By 1945, along with Gus Greenbaum, he was running the El Cortez Hotel with great success. Sedway was also instrumental in the financing and construction of the Flamingo Hotel when William R. Wilkerson ran into financial difficulties. He saw the Flamingo as a unique opportunity for their group to expand operations in Las Vegas. Minutes after Bugsy Siegel's murder, Sedway and Greenbaum took possession of the Flamingo. No one questioned or disputed their authority. Under their partnership, the Flamingo became a non-exclusive facility affordable to almost anyone. They made the enterprise extremely successful. In the first year alone, Mo Sedway and Greenbaum turned a $4 million profit. On Father's Day in 1957, Burman died on the operating table during surgery to remove polyps from his colon. While he lived in Minneapolis, he met and married Gladys Uld, a German-American dancer who later converted to Judaism. Their only child, a daughter named Susan Burman, wrote a book about growing up in Las Vegas as mob royalty. The book is titled Easy Street, written between 1981 and 1983. In it, Susan indicates she knew little of her father's past until an acquaintance brought it to her attention. His wife, Gladys Burman, died shortly after David Burman, at age 39 of an overdose of barbiturates. It is unclear whether it was suicide or a mob murder for refusing to give up Burman's shares in the Flamingo. Iser Blumenfeld was a Jewish-American organized crime figure based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, for over 4 decades and remains the most notorious mobster in the history of Minnesota. The power and influence he held in Minneapolis were often compared to that of Al Capone in Chicago, as he was associated with several high-profile crimes in the city's history, including his alleged involvement in the murder of a cab driver and the attempted murders of police officer James H. Trepanier and newspaperman Walter Liggett. He is also thought to have participated in the dismantling of the Twin City Line Street Railway during the early 1950s. Blumenfeld was convicted of violating the Mann Act in 1959. After a short prison term, he retired to Miami Beach, Florida, where he and Meyer Lansky operated a real estate empire. He was involved in organized crime in Miami Beach and Havana, Cuba, until his death. During childhood, Iser had to leave school and support his family by selling newspapers on Minneapolis's Newspaper Row. At the time, the best-selling locations had to be held by force against gangs of other boys. Blumenfeld would also tell stories of how he had made extra money picking up bus tokens and reselling them. Enraged by the poverty of his family, he turned to running errands for the pimps and madams of Minneapolis's red light district. With the onset of Prohibition, Blumenfeld and his brothers were transformed from small-time hoods into major figures in the American mafia. His ties to the Chicago outfit and New York's Genovese crime family date back to the Prohibition period. According to a later trial, they would legally import industrial-grade alcohol from Canada, ostensibly for their perfume factory, and divert it to their illegal distilleries in the forests near Fort Snelling. Also, according to the book Minnesota 13, Blumenfeld and his brothers made frequent trips to Stearns County, Minnesota, to purchase the area's legendary moonshine from local farmers. Some was disposed of in the Twin Cities, but most of it was sold to the Chicago outfit, which was then bossed by Al Capone. The same book also alleges that the Blumenfelds owned a lakeside cabin near Melrose, Minnesota. By his 20s, Blumenfeld and his brothers, Harry Bloom and Udi Bloom, held considerable power over the Jewish neighborhoods in North Minneapolis. They oversaw illegal activities such as bootlegging, prostitution, and labor racketeering. According to sources, Blumenfeld's rivalry with Minneapolis's Irish mob ended after he and Irish mob boss, Tommy Banks, divided their territories with a handshake. A number of deaths are attributed to him and his gang, including journalists who were killed after writing articles exposing the inner workings of his organization and his ties to corrupt politicians. A Jewish restaurant owner recalls that during that era and years after, the Blumenfelds were worshipped by several generations of neighborhood boys. There was a high degree of political and civil corruption in the region in the 1920s and 1930s. The mainstream newspapers hardly mentioned what was going on, as any outlet that published articles critical of the status quo were threatened. Some small tabloid newspapers attempted to report what was going on, but reporters and editors quickly became targets. Howard Guilford of the Twin City Reporter was shot and killed on September 6, 1934. A decade later, the paper lost another reporter when Arthur Casherman was killed on January 22, 1945. The most notorious murder was that of Walter Liggett, the founder and editor of a weekly paper called the Midwest American. He had been threatened and offered bribes to stay quiet, but he persisted in reporting on links he found between organized crime figures and Minnesota's ruling Farmer Labor Party. Walter was beaten up, prosecuted for a non-existent rape incident, and finally died after being machine-gunned in the alley behind his home on December 9, 1935. His wife and daughter witnessed the assassination, as did several neighbors. All identified Iser Blumenfeld as the shooter. He was indicted by a grand jury, but poor investigative work and a careless trial meant that he was acquitted. Liggett's widow would always believe that Minnesota Governor Floyd Olson was deeply involved in the murder. Her husband had repeatedly accused the governor of corruption. However, Blumenfeld was indicted for the killing of a taxicab driver and was also suspected of being responsible for the attempted murder of police officer James Trepanier. Paul McCabby writes that Blumenfeld was present in the area of the crime. He had no part of the shooting, which was likely committed by fugitive bank robber Vern Miller. As the area streetcar system was being dismantled in the early 1950s and replaced with diesel buses, Blumenfeld owned a 16% stake in the company. He was accused of allying himself with a corporate raider, using force to intimidate stockholders, and disposing of the scrap metal on the black market after their hostile takeover had succeeded. Some sources believe he held considerable responsibility for what happened, but when a federal court case led several executives from the company to go to prison, he was not convicted. What remained of Twin City Rapid Transit was taken over at the behest of Governor Orville Freeman by noted Minneapolitan Carl Pollett in 1960. He was convicted on federal charges of transporting a Chicago prostitute named Virginia Tollison across state lines. Although this conviction was later overturned on appeal, he was again tried and convicted of jury tampering and extorting kickbacks from bars and nightclubs throughout Minneapolis. The extortion was carried out by threatening to deny them liquor licenses. During the sentencing phase of this trial, it was revealed the Kid Can was receiving a cut of the money skimmed from at least one Las Vegas casino. After his release from prison, he moved to Miami Beach with his friend Meyer Lansky. They reportedly continued to make money through illegal activities, though they changed tack, focusing instead on stock market fraud, money laundering, and questionable real estate dealings. He frequently visited his family and friends in Minnesota and declared to a Minneapolis reporter in 1976 that he had recently turned down an offer to write his memoirs. He said, "I have nothing to say, my life is very simple." He died in Minneapolis in the summer of 1981. Tales of Kid Can and his rumored dark deeds may be considered to have made him a local urban legend, similar to Al Capone or Whitey Bulger. Two tales are told of the origins of his famous nickname. According to one legend, he picked up the name during a brief attempt at boxing. Another story told by his fellow North Side Jews alleges that young Iser Blumenfeld would always lock himself in the outhouse to avoid gang fights in the neighborhood. Kid Can indignantly denied both versions. In later years, he was alleged to have installed bulletproof windows on his suburban house and to have been able to fix any problem with a single phone call. Antonio Musso was the first boss of the Rockford crime family in Illinois, which he led from 1933 until his death in 1958. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had traveled across the Atlantic from Sicily and settled in Madison, Wisconsin. While in Madison, he operated a small gambling ring, a profitable pool hall, and was said to be a suspect in the murder of a local racketeer named Anton Navarra that took place in April of 1924. During the early days of Prohibition, Musso made a name for himself as the bootlegging king. He operated out of the Bush section of Madison. By 1926, he had moved in on the territory of Rockford, Illinois. Determined to control the most profitable rackets in the city, he systematically set about eliminating or controlling the competition. It was said that by the late 1920s, he, along with mobsters Gasper Kao, Anthony Riella, and Joseph Zamudo, had fulfilled his goal. With the exception of the Javingo brothers, all bootleggers, speakeasy operators and whiskey haulers now answered to Musso and company. When the Javingo refused to comply with the new order, Joe, one of the Javingo brothers, was murdered in 1930. It was said the hit was carried out by future boss Joseph Zamudo or someone close to him. Joseph Zamudo's rise to the top was briefly stalled. He was convicted in a sweep against gangsters involved in bootlegging. He would serve a brief 2-year hitch from 1930 to 1932. This would be the only noticeable time he served behind bars. Upon Zamudo's return from prison, it was evident that Antonio Musso was being backed by the Milwaukee crime family and the Chicago outfit. He was said to be a good friend of Al Capone. He was also in good standings with the Zudo brothers of Springfield. The St. Louis crime family would dub Musso the Crown Prince. His final opponent in the bootlegging racket was the last Giovinco brother, Paul, who he had murdered in 1933. After eliminating the Giovinco brothers, Antonio Musso had only one more hurdle, which was local bookmaker Charles Kalb. It was said that Kalb was the top gambler and lay-off bookie around Rockford. By now, every vice peddler within the Rockford area was giving payments to Musso's organization, with the exception of Charles Kalb. After failing to heed several warnings, Charles Kalb was murdered in December 1937. Following this, Musso would become the first official boss of Rockford and have a 20-year run at the top. He rarely came under the scrutiny of law enforcement. One item of note regarding Musso was his ability to pave the way for relocating gangsters. One in particular was Sam Oliveri, who was born in Palermo, Sicily in 1895. Sam had first relocated to Chicago. He then became involved with what was called the Calumet City Cheese War. On the lam and looking for a home, Musso invited him to Rockford. When the gangster arrived, he quickly decided he wanted to go into the funeral business. He proceeded to pressure John Gasparini, a well-known and established funeral parlor operator. When he refused, Musso intervened, and Gasparini had a new partner. Oliveri would remain an active soldier until his death in 1969. The funeral home would often be used for a meeting spot to iron out differences. It is still in operation today. As the 1950s began, the Rockford crime family continued to prosper. Now aging and in poor health, Musso did not attend the mob summit in upstate New York, held in 1957. The historic meeting that was raided by local police ended up being a disaster. It was noted that Musso's longtime underboss, Gasper Kao, was not in attendance either. Musso had sent Captain Joe Zudo to represent the Rockford regime. Zudo, along with others, were picked up during the raid. The following year in May, Antonio Musso died. Following the upstate fiasco and subsequent death of Musso in 1958, Zudo forced Gasper Kao to step down as acting boss so he could assume control of the Rockford crime family. Joseph Zudo enjoyed a carefree run as top boss and was considered a close associate to both Milwaukee Phil and Joseph Iupa of the Chicago outfit. The new Rockford hierarchy was as follows: Joseph Zudo as boss, Charlie Vince as underboss, and Joe Zito as his consigliere, with Frank Buscemi sometimes stepping in as acting boss or consigliere. The boss would also keep high-ranking members such as Sebastian Gulata and Phil Cannella armed and at his side at all times. Zudo would invest heavily in restaurant establishments. At one time he held significant interest in at least 5 restaurants, 3 which were Italian. At least 3 are still in operation today. In comparison to Milwaukee or Chicago, the Rockford crime family was much smaller and reached its heights under the reign of Joseph Zudo. The FBI could only document up to 30 made members at best. In 1965, Zudo showed he was as cold as any mob boss when he approved of the murder of Rockford mobster Charles LaFranca. The murdered mob soldier was found strangled in the trunk of his car. His murder has never been solved and no one has ever been charged. It is quite possible that LaFranca refused to come to the regular meetings held at the Aragona Social Club. This was Zudo's primary office during the 60s and 70s, which was located on Kent Street in Rockford. In December 1968, a grand jury convened to question members of the Rockford crime family regarding their illicit activities. The investigation specifically was interested in the crime family's influence over liquor license violations. At the time, most lounges were in some way connected to the Rockford crime family. Joseph Zudo, Joe Zito, Frank Buscemi and Joe Magio were called. Other members were later called as well, but little came from the effort. The Rockford crime family has always been low-key. This was never more apparent than in 1972. In August of that year, John A. Liotta, the legendary crime figure and father, passed away. Rockford Captain Phil Priola, owner of Town and Country Motel, placed a call that was probably ordered by Zudo regarding their attendance at the A. Liotta funeral. Priola relayed a message to the Milwaukee Syndicate that no one from Rockford would be attending the service. This was not an issue of respect, but rather based on fear that FBI would have a surveillance team on hand. By 1973, Joseph Zudo had eased out of the boss's seat. The FBI reports that during that year, Frank Buscemi had gained control of the Rockford rackets, but this wasn't really the case. Boss Joseph Zudo merely preferred spending long winters in Florida. He would assume a role as a dual consigliere alongside Joe Zito. Zudo would permanently fill this role following the death of Zito in 1981, instead of being full-time boss of the family. The Zito funeral is noteworthy because the FBI clearly photographed Buscemi, Zudo and Joseph Iupa of the Chicago outfit in attendance. Although semi-retired, Zudo was not far from the action nor the politics. In December 1972, Joe Magio was convicted in a bizarre case involving mail fraud and boat registration. Along with James Schwartz of Rockford and William Blake of Michigan City, Magio had attempted to form a scheme under the name United States Merchant Marine. The scheme involved boat owners to submit a fee for free registration. The case was largely built on an informant's testimony. The informant then provided proof that Magio somehow was under the belief that a national agency would allow him to access FBI records. Magio was ultimately convicted of 7 counts of mail fraud. This attempt to access FBI records quickly came to the attention of the Rockford crime family. Beginning in the 1970s, Sicilian immigrants started showing up in southern Michigan, Rockford and other surrounding areas. What the authorities would not know until nearly 12 years later and following the trial known as the Pizza Connection case was that a massive heroin pipeline that flowed from Sicily to the northeastern United States and also connected into the Midwest was starting to take off. The immigrants, or Zips as they were called, laundered the illegal dollars through pizza shops from heroin trafficking and sent them back to Sicily. One Zip in particular, Pietro Alfano, operated a shop out of Oregon. He was the nephew to Gaetano Badalamenti, mafia boss from Cinisi, Sicily. Zudo was relaxing in Fort Lauderdale throughout the fall and winter of 1979 when the FBI started noticing several Rockford mobsters visiting him at his home. On April 6, 1980, Winnebago County deputies found Magio dead in the backseat of his car. He had been executed with 1 bullet to the head, shot at close range. Authorities believe that the Florida meetings with Zudo was for approval to murder Magio. Deputies found $25,000 on Magio. It was believed to have been left there on purpose for his grieving wife to claim. To date, there has never been a suspect named in the Magio case. Zudo would continue on as consigliere. Later in life he held the position in name only, and in May 1990, he passed away from natural causes while living in Rockford. Gasper Kao was born on September 13, 1891, in Casteldaccia, Sicily. He left for America in 1923 and eventually found himself in Springfield, Illinois. While there, he teamed up with the Zudo brothers. Joe Zudo would soon become a key figure in the Rockford rackets. His brother Frank became an untouchable crime boss of Springfield who was allied to the Rockford crime family and the Chicago outfit. Joe Zudo would eventually become Gasper Kao's brother-in-law. While in Springfield, Kao was arrested for violating the Prohibition Act. He was said to be one of the top bootleggers that engaged heavy in prostitution, along with the Zudo brothers. By the mid-1920s, Kao and Zudo ventured to Rockford and formed alliances with Antonio Musso and Anthony Riella. Riella would eventually become a captain in the Bonagio crime family in New Jersey. The relationship between Riella, Zalo, and Zudo would endure for 40 years, all the way into the late 1960s. During the early days of their tenure, Kao and Zudo established the Sunlight Dairy, which later became Devon Products. In 1961 the company was purchased by Muller Pinehurst Dairy Incorporated. By the time Antonio Musso became boss, Kao was already well established and well respected. Musso made him his underboss, a spot Gasper Kao would hold for 20 years. When Musso passed away in May 1958, Kao assumed the seat as boss. However, one of Musso's top captains, Joseph Zudo, thought differently. He had the majority of Rockford's captains supporting him. Kao eventually respected the decision and stepped down as boss, although some believed he was only acting boss until Zudo returned. Reminiscent of the warning shot fired at Luciano crime boss Frank Costello in 1957, Kao received similar treatment following Musso's death. His personal residence was fired upon. Kao got the picture and relinquished his throne within months of proclaiming it to Zudo. It was believed that Tony Riella, evidenced by phone calls placed to Kao and the Zudo brothers, had a hand in smoothing out bad feelings and any further acts of violence against his longtime friend. By now Kao had grown very wealthy through property holdings, which were obviously purchased through illicit funds. He had also made a habit of sending money back to Sicily to be invested on him and the family businesses. It was believed to be at the urging of his wife that he retired from the Rockford crime family, and in October 1961 both returned to Sicily. Gasper Kao lived in luxury for over 10 years, free from any hassles or mafia politics. He died in July 1973 while residing in Casteldaccia, Sicily, a rich man. If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.